Thank you, Brian. Okay, thank you. I'm happy to be here and to join you. I'm sorry that the schedule has meant that I have to do this briefly. When I asked Brian what should I say, he said, well, say anything you want except make it short. And be provocative, he said. But mainly be brief. So I'll try to be provocative and brief at the same time. I should say, referring to what he said in the Consul General's figures, I do think those are all taken from our annual survey. This is an annual survey we do of the transatlantic economy. It does every state in the Union plus all the EU countries by jobs, trade, and investment across the Atlantic. So it's the most up-to-date figures. All the figures I heard today are from this study. I don't know. The best compliment is usually when people don't know that they're citing someone, so that was good. I appreciate it. I was going to talk a bit about that. I'll try to be briefer on that. I'm going to leave with Brian here. We have a mini-me versions of this study, which I'll just leave with you. And I should just say, we also have just released this year something called Europe 2020, Competitive or Complacent, which maps the EU's links economically with all other world regions and provides, I think, mental maps, new maps of how the EU works in the world. So I'll just leave that with you. So I'm going to, in Brian's admonition here, give you 3 points and then be happy to discuss. I think first point I would make is that America's election next year is likely to be decided in part by Europe's economy. And I say that for a bit of the reasons that you already heard, but I think just to go through the basic argument, for all the talk about the rise of China and emerging markets, the relationship, the economic relationship between Europe and the United States is by far, not even close, the most extensive and deepest of any relationship between any two continents on the planet. And that globalization has driven that relationship even closer, so that we have never had a higher stake in each other's economic success in history than we do today. And that this economic linkage has deepened since the end of the Cold War, not lessened. So contrary to the notion that we're drifting apart because we don't have a common enemy, our societies are actually colliding and are more deeply independent than before. And I think that's a basic sort of theme, that globalization or interdependence is not an even process. It's not a flat world. It's a bumpy world. Linkages are thick or thin between different continents, and the thickness or thinness really matters. How are you linked to other continents, and in what ways? And what are the transmission belts between continents that affect people's lives? And so my point is that Europe and the United States are more deeply linked than anybody else. So in good times, that's a good thing. In bad times, the transmission belt works the other way. And we're seeing that. In the recession a few years ago, it was mainly a US problem and went over to Europe and really hit the Europeans. Now we're in danger that it could come back. And that's what I mean by my first point. So let me just sort of give you some of this, the narrative. I was struck, even though the Consul Generals used the figures, I believe, that we have, they still start with trade. And I think it's important that trade is important. $280 billion worth of goods the U.S. exports to the EU, and 320 that we import from the EU. Big trading relationship. Not as big, though, as with Asia. And it's very important, but goods trade is only part of it. Usually media only talk about goods trade. And what's important to understand is that the United States and Europe are the biggest services economies in the world, and that the services trade between the two is absolutely phenomenal. We are each other's by far most important services market. Most jobs in the United States and in Europe are in the services economy. About 80% of all jobs in the United States and in Europe are there. That's where people work, not other places. We've become so productive in manufacturing and agriculture that people progressively are not working there. So if you want to create jobs, you have to focus on services. And services is a transatlantic phenomenon, bar none. No one else in the world really has much of a services economy. Only Brazil, in fact, interestingly, probably would count. The second is that most media and most political leaders, and in fact consuls general, ignore the critical difference which distinguishes the transatlantic economy, and that is investment. If you had to say what's the biggest difference between our relationship with Europe and our relationship with Asia, it is this. The European-American relationship is an investment-driven relationship, not a trade-driven relationship, whereas our relationship with Asia is a trade-driven relationship and not an investment-driven relationship. That's the basic point. And what I'm always stunned by is that media often use trade figures as if that's commerce. Trade is a very misleading benchmark of commerce. It's only one piece of it, and it's usually only goods trade that they're even talking about. So it's in multiple ways skewed from the reality. If you add investment and trade and all their components, you recenter your mental map of the world to see why everybody says the transatlantic relationship is still the fulcrum of the global economy. But we don't read much about that. It's all about trade issues, not about investment. So European investment in the United States is far greater than its trade. Even Germany, a country that's sort of billed as a trading nation, the classic trading country, German investments in the United States are about 4 times what their trade is with the United States. German companies don't operate anymore the way the textbooks are written, or even German government representatives talk about it. They come to the United States because they want to invest in a big continental market, and that's why in the last 20 years German investment in the United States has been such a big motor. And vice versa. U.S. investment in Europe is phenomenal. U.S. by far is the most important source of flows into Europe in terms of producing for the European economy. There's more European investment in Texas than all of U.S. investment in Japan and China put together. There's more European investment in Utah than all of U.S. investment in China and Japan put together. You can make the same statement for 38 U.S. states. Any one of them by itself is bigger than our investment relationship with the largest economies in Asia, because we don't have an investment relationship really with Asian economies. And that has a lot of knock-on effects. Investment means you invest in a community. Investment means you're putting jobs there. It's a deeper form of integration. Trade is a shallow form of integration. You're sending things somewhere else. It also creates jobs. But the ripple effects through distributor networks and all sorts of other things has much more impact than the trade figures. So anybody who starts with trade as their orientation point misses the point, would be my point now. And that 2/3 of the trade across the Atlantic is driven by investment. It's intercompany trade. It's BMW in Munich sending parts to BMW in Spartanburg, South Carolina. It's 3M in St. Paul, Minnesota, sending office supplies to its subsidiaries in London. It's that type of trade that is now the real dynamic of the transatlantic economy, because companies invest on both sides and trade within themselves. That's how they also hedge against currency differences. So when you see the dollar-euro changes all the time, they've learned how to buffer that. We don't have that relationship at all with our Asian partners. It's mainly trade-driven. And so that's just a very different dynamic. And so that's why the figures you did here, Texas, the #1 state for European investment, over $58 billion in the last year that we have the data. That's more than 28 other states put together, just Texas. So a significant relationship. It's not just energy. It's also computers. It's all the kinds of things related to machinery and all of that as well. So it's a diversified picture. It's not just an energy-driven relationship. The other point is that it's a high-value relationship. The United States and Europe are knowledge economies. Companies choose sometimes to invest in cheap third-world labor markets because of the cheap third-world labor. But that, for most companies, is kind of a static cost, whereas knowledge is the dynamic element of competitiveness and what drives their profits. So if you want to be competitive in the world today, you're going to go invest where the knowledge is. You're going to invest to get an extra slice of knowledge, which is going to turn into extra slice of profit for your company. And that's why, overwhelmingly, R&D flows among corporate America and corporate Europe are in each other's economies. corporate Europe's R&D investment in the United States is massive. It is basically eclipses anything else. It's about 15% of all total U.S. R&D spending. And U.S. companies are absolutely essential to European R&D. So the transmission belts of the Transatlantic economy, is my point, amplify the good times, but in bad times, in a dual crisis that we're in, they can make it particularly bad. So if Europe now heads into really trouble, it was the rock on the scale of the American economy by next winter. It's going to either go, the rock's going to go on one side of the scale or the other. If it's bad, I think the U.S. starts to dip into recession. If they start to pull out and their markets react, it could help the United States marginally, although of course we have our own problems. So we could talk about those details if you'd like. Let me turn, though, to the second point now, which is looking past the immediate crisis, and that we each face very deep currents of change. If you look out over the next decade or so, what are really the core fundamental trends that are affecting Europe and the United States? Many of them are the same, but many of them will affect Europe and the United States, I would argue, somewhat differently. And so the challenge is going to be, are these trends going to draw us together, or are they going to drive us apart? And I think that's the ultimate question in terms of thinking about the future of the relationship. One trend, deficits and debt. We've talked about that. I think you talked about that a lot already today. So I don't need to go into that, except to say I think it's a watershed moment. Either it's the spur to more competitive economies on both sides of the Atlantic, or it's the moment both sides start to lose out to much more vigorous rising economies elsewhere. In essence, it's a political crisis, not an economic one. Our government might be broke, but this country is not poor. We are paying a high economic price for evading political decisions. And I would argue in Europe it's the same. It's a different issue for Europe. It has to do with their solidarity and the future of their project, but it's in essence a political crisis. And they are paying a huge economic price for not dealing with the politics of this. So that's one issue. Second issue is demographics. That was mentioned briefly, so I don't want to repeat it, except to say both societies are aging, but the United States, because of its immigration tradition, it's a much more youthful type of population, will have a less severe reaction to this than Europe. Europe is pioneering sort of the age of aging, if you will, on all continents. All the continents are aging. Africa's doing much less than that, but Asia is also aging as well. But Europe's there first. And it will actually get out of its cycle in about 20, 30 years when much of Asia is about to go into it. So one can think about it one way or the other. The bad news for Europe is it's aging, and a much bigger, older population is going to have to be supported by a smaller, youthful population. That's going to, and in a time of low or no growth, that's a problem. But you could also think about it as a possibility for innovation. If Europe has to pioneer aging societies first, then it can pioneer the social innovation that would have to come with that. It has to come with that. They don't really have a choice. But whether they take advantage of that, I think, is a question. And if they are the pioneer in that type of social innovation, that might be an opportunity for Europe, rather than always think about demographics as the real negative. A third issue is migration, related to that, migration and mobility. And here again, different traditions. Although it's important to note that Europe is actually the world's #1 destination for the world's migrants, if you compare continents. It's still, most people tend to go to Europe. The difference is they are the unskilled. If you take the pool of legal migrants around the world, about 55% of them go to Europe, unskilled, and only about 5% to the United States. That's legal. So obviously our number is higher, but it's not 55%. Whereas the skilled labor floating around the world, where does it go? 85% comes to the United States, and only 5% comes to Europe. Europe has a significant problem, not only in terms of the kinds of migrants it's attracting, but what it does with them when they get there. It's become a magnet for the unskilled at a time when its aging population demands skills and integration. I would argue that's Europe's Achilles heel at the moment, is this challenge. And that it doesn't have a sort of a pan-Europe talent strategy to attract high-skilled labor or to keep it there once they get there. Whereas the United States, we have many problems, but that isn't as much one of them as, again, how it'll affect Europe. Next issue is the rise of other powers. We've talked about that also quite a bit. I think the challenge here is many of these rising powers do not necessarily share the basic norms and standards of the global order that has arisen over the last 6, 7 decades. The US and Europe were basically the creators of that order. And the challenge is now, with the rise of those powers wanting a greater voice, on what basis do they want that voice? Are they going to be responsible stakeholders in a new type of order, or irresponsible stakeholders? We disagree on use of force, on sovereignty issues, self-determination issues, basic norms of liberal economic market state issues. There's a whole host of issues in which there's some basic disagreements here. And I think the question is, do these states want to accommodate themselves within the existing order, or do they want to challenge it? I think their decision relies on what the US and Europe do. If we are consistent in upholding the norms that we ourselves have put forward, then those norms are stronger and they're more attractive to others. If we can show at home that we are creating a model that's good for our own people, then the norms by which that model is based is stronger everywhere else. But if we are not able to do that, or if we each seek to eke out marginal advantage in third markets, third countries, rather than join together to uphold high standards that improve the lives of our people, we'll have the Chinese standard. I think it's a simple choice. Related to that is energy, the other basic trend I would just say. You probably already talked about this. I would make this one simple point. A world with 9 billion people on the planet using energy the way we are using it today doesn't work. Math doesn't work. Not going to happen. So it's a basic choice. It is arguably, I would argue, the generational challenge we face. It is the #1 topic. How to break the link between the production of wealth and the consumption of resources. That's the topic. That is our ultimate challenge. Even climate change is a subsidiary challenge to that. If we could break that link and devise a new type of model, then we'd have a lot of answers to climate change as well. But if you focus only on climate change, you're missing actually the center point issue. And here, frankly, I think it's the other way around. Here, I think Europe, for a variety of reasons, is farther along in that area and could basically take a lead in sort of thinking about how to break that link, both for good and bad reasons, its own energy dependence, but also much of its energy efficiency model. So let me leave that at that. So the point here is that the United States and Europe together, they're no longer preeminent, but they are still predominant. There's been a slight shift, but it's not the shift of total falling in the hole that one sort of reads about too often. We are still necessary, but we are no longer sufficient in and of ourselves to forge global coalitions and get things done. But without us, nothing is going to get done. And finally, we are no longer the free world, but we can be the anchor in a far freer world if we join and uphold the norms that we have espoused for so long and show others that that model works at home. And I think that now is our main challenge on both sides. The question is whether Europeans will have the will to do this together, and whether Americans have the patience, frankly, to work with a Europe that they don't understand, and that is very hard to get together as a partner. And whether either side has the wallet anymore to try to make this happen. My last point, just to put forward a way forward, I would suggest, is that reviving the transatlantic relationship in this type of globalizing world means redefining Atlanticism itself. And I would suggest in the following ways. If you read about, the media, our political debate here, Europe, most everywhere, it conflates globalization with the rise of the Pacific. Those are two different phenomena. They're related, but globalization by definition is not about only Asia-Pacific. It's about how continents are connecting everywhere, all continents. And those interconnections also are happening across the Atlantic, the full Atlantic, 4 continents of the Atlantic. We have tended, because of Cold War and our traditions, to define Atlanticism as the North Atlantic. And yet, if we think about globalization today, the connections now being developed across the 4 continents of the Atlantic Basin are far deeper and accelerating quickly than anything we've ever seen, and yet no one talks about it. You can't find anything on it. We're doing some things on it, but we're doing it because no one else is talking about it. And so I think we have to think about this and simply change the mental map. And it relates to, I think, the debate you had earlier about the GMF survey, global trends, the transatlantic trends about, do Americans think more about the Pacific or the or Europe or Asia? That's an interesting question, but I think for me, that sort of begs the point. The point is the United States is an Atlantic and a Pacific power. We think about both, sometimes a bit more or less depending what the issues are. But behind that is that the United States is a pivotal power. It is both. And we have failed as a country to take advantage of our Atlantic, our full Atlantic option as we think about how to position the United States in the world. And so I think we have to think deeper about that. I think the either-or question about Europe or Asia is more a European fear. It says more about the person who's asking the question, it seems to me, than the reality of the United States. And so I think we need to get out of that box and look at the Atlantic hemisphere. Many people in Asia today talk about the Asian hemisphere. That's interesting. The definition, Asia then excludes the United States by definition of how they've defined it. It's not the Asia-Pacific anymore, it's Asia. Well, if there's an Asian hemisphere, there's also then an Atlantic hemisphere. And what are the dynamics of the Atlantic hemisphere? The United States gets more energy from the Atlantic Basin than it does from the Middle East. And that trend is going to accelerate. It's not going to decline. There's more commerce going on across the Atlantic Basin than in the Pacific. Again, back to some basic points. And yet, that seems to be ignored. You can talk a bit about the negative parts of this, too. The transatlantic drug trade now is not only north-south, it's also south-south. The drug trade now flowing from South America to Africa is becoming quite critical, and it links into demand both in Europe and the United States. So it's becoming a circular type of thing. If you think about human trafficking, if you think about drugs and disease, all the sort of the negative parts of globalization, that's also happening all through the Atlantic sphere. And yet we have no mechanisms. It's not even a topic about how to even engage on this. And yet if you think about the Atlantic Basin, it has more democratic countries than any part of the world. It has 3 of the 5 UN Security Council members. It has more members of the UN than any part of the world. There are lots of things that you could talk about. It has Brazil rising, is looking for its future. South Africa, all sorts of issues. There are problems, obviously, in South America and in Africa. But there's a growing middle class. There's lots of other things happening there, and those linkages are going to impinge on us. And so that comes to a sort of a different notion here that back to the security implications. It's not about projecting old institutions like NATO to this kind of space. It's thinking about real security for real people, which is all the arteries that carry goods, people, services, money, data, that keep free societies flowing are increasingly vulnerable. They're interlinked and they're vulnerable, and none of them are national. And so ultimately what we have to protect today is our interconnectedness. And that, I think, starts actually, because the deepest interconnections are across the Atlantic. And so if we think about how to deal with this on an international basis, we have to do it with your closest partners. If we can't get the systems about resilient societies right with our closest partners, how are we possibly going to do it with systems that are very, very different than our own? So I think there's a big challenge there, but I think a big opportunity to sort of reshift our mental map think about the future. So in the end, I just say, I think that some of the keys to this are realizing how deeply bound we really are, understanding some of the facts of the case. Secondly, using that common base then to reposition ourselves for the kind of world we're facing. And third, redefining even what that base is, to incorporate a whole new dimension of partners and issues that we haven't dealt with before. So let me leave it with that, and I'm happy to discuss. Thank you.